Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 71, Ancient Philosophy, right? And so this is week 10 for us. So after today, after this week, we only had 2 weeks left. And so we continue today with Aristotle, right? We did one part of Aristotle. We are reading books from the Nicomachean Ethics, right? So last time we saw for week 9, book 1, basically, and then I touched on toward the end um, book 2, right? The topic for that we are doing today, right? I mean, from sections from book 2 and then also book 3, and that is all that we are doing, right? In relation to Aristotle, remember that this is the final section of the class. We are doing Aristotle, and then week 11 we'll do Epictetus, and the last week, week 12, Lucretius. Right, we began the first part of the class, right? I mean, we did in the first 4 weeks, in addition to an introduction, right? We also then got into Lao Tzu in the Chinese, ancient Chinese tradition, Confucius, then we did Buddha, and then in the second part of the class, the pre-Socratics, right, the philosophers coming before Socrates, from the 7th to the 5th century BC in the Greek world, right, and then we did Socrates and Plato, and now Aristotle. Okay, so last time I highlighted some important concepts, especially in book 1, but they are important throughout, right? I mean, happiness, the concept of happiness, and I asked you to write your entry about that, right, on a blackboard. Happiness, eudaimonia. If you remember, the word is in the syllabus, right? To be in good spirit, even in the face of difficulties, in the face of adversities, right? I mean, one cannot be happy in the usual sense of happiness when something difficult, even something terrible happens, and yet this concept of eudaimonia, of being in good spirit, of ultimately the good life, which is also the mean, the middle intermediate point between two extremes, comes back today. This is what really happiness is, to be kept in a lifetime, right? I mean, again, I spoke about this last time, a kind of a sense of balance. That doesn't mean that it is simply average, that it is like a kind of a gray life of moderation. That is not the case. But it is, to know the right measure of things. Right, so in any case, and then especially important, in addition to happiness, eudaimonia, was also the concept of, remember, the function of a human being, ergon, right, the function or work of a human being, that Aristotle, right, told us is activity of the psyche in accordance with virtue, okay, with excellence. That's what it is. The fact, ultimately, remember that we never stop, never cease being human beings, whatever we do, right? So that's the idea. So, but in book 2, we see what, moral character is, the construction of one's moral character. Okay, so first of all, we saw that at the end already of book 1, and then that's where he also, Aristotle, begins book 2. The distinction between, right, these two types of virtue, virtues, right, those of intellectual virtues in the mind that can be taught and learned, right? I mean, people learn these virtues maybe early on, I mean, the family, school, and so on and so forth, and the other, the ones that we are going to deal with, more important, probably from the moral, ethical point of view, precisely the moral virtues, the virtues of a character, right, that must be, one must train in order to bring them about. Okay, one must activate the capacity, one must make a habit, and the word habit is in Greek ethos, precisely ethos, ethos, from which ethics, right? So what then may become a kind, what we say at times, a second nature, right? When I am then a good or bad or just or unjust and so on, that then it becomes easier for me to continue that way once I have become one thing or the other. It becomes kind of like a second nature, but it is really the result of a habituation process, an activation process, a process of a repetition of the same action over and over again. But in any case, one of the most important concepts here is the concept of the mean. Like I said, the intermediate point we will see between too much and too little. So I ask you to write about that, but also about the other, right? Concepts and problems that arise, okay, from the reading, the discussion today, and actually the keywords I put on in the syllabus for you are precisely virtue, which is the same as excellence. Virtue, remember the opposite of virtue is vice. We'll talk about that, VICE. And then the mean, precisely, which is the best virtue ultimately, right? And then decision, which comes in book 3, decision, and the same as decision, the principle of action. Okay, let me say a few words about this now because I don't know how much time we have later, but the principle of action is, right, the difference is here between action and the principle of action, right? We act, we do something, but the question is whether we act freely, precisely, let's say, or not. I mean, whether we can also not do what we are doing, right? Whether the principle of action, what starts the action, the reason, if you will, whether it is within us or outside us. I mean, in other words, if I do something because someone forces me to do it, right? I mean, a situation of violence. It can be institutional violence or, just behavioral violence. Or if I do it because of some kind of internal compulsion that I can't refrain from doing something, although I shouldn't do it, I don't want to do it, and so on, then I'm not acting in a way that is really, ethically important, right? I mean, because again, the principle of action is not within me, right? So I can't ultimately be able to control the action. And so, in any case, that's what we are going to see also in book 3, when he speaks about Aristotle, the difference between voluntary and involuntary action. Okay, so write about this stuff. And I want to say that at the beginning of book 2, and maybe I read a few lines here and there, but the beginning of book 2 is also really great, right? I mean, he says virtue, then I'm reading from your version that you have, is right, being of two kinds, like I said, intellectual and moral. Right? Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time. While moral virtue, which in another version that I usually use is called virtue of a character, right? Moral virtue comes about as a result of a habit, right? Like I said, and that's whence also its name, ethique, in parentheses, is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos. Ethos, you have the word habit. That's the meaning. Okay, we could say more, but for now this is okay. Okay, ethos is habit. Okay. From this, it is also plain, I'm reading again, that none of the moral virtues, this is very important, arises in us by nature. Okay, the moral virtues, the virtues of the character we have, to be courageous, to be brave, right? To be cowardly instead, or rash, reckless. This is not something that happens in us or that arises in us by nature. We are not naturally one way or the other. Okay, so that's basically the point. Very important point. Okay, because there is so much confusion about this, and even today people say, I mean, speaking about whatever human nature, or that it is in someone's nature to be what they are, and so on and so forth. Aristotle early on says no, this is the wrong way to go. So I leave that up to you. I leave that to you to think about this. Whether we are good or bad, good or evil, and so on and so forth, because of some kind of natural, right, disposition and so on, as many people, according to Aristotle, and I agree, incorrectly think, or whether it is actually a matter of, habituation and the formation of a character. Okay, so think about that, right? So, and actually, he gives some of his wonderful examples. He says, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. Meaning, if something is in that way, in that condition by nature, you cannot change it. Okay? And he says precisely, for instance, that's one of the wonderful examples. For instance, the stone, which by nature moves downwards, cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it, a stone, right, by throwing it up 10,000 times. Okay? The moving downwards doesn't change because that's nature, precisely. Whatever is nature is fixed, cannot be changed. Okay? So I skip a few lines. Then he says, neither by nature, then nor contrary to nature, neither nor. Okay, this is a very important logic of a neither nor. Okay, I particularly like this one, but neither nor, neither by nature nor against nature, contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Right, the virtues and therefore the vices, right? Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them. We have, right, this equipment. We are equipped, right? I mean, we have this competence, basic competence. We can, and we are then made perfect and are made perfect by habits, right? Meaning, we had to train. And activate a capacity which is there, yes, but the capacity is twofold, manifold. I had the capacity to do good things, bad things. If I always do good things, I will become good, right? That's the perfection, the excellence to which I get. Or otherwise, I will perfect the other device, right? Because technically it's the same, right? If I do bad things, then I will then become bad, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we had the competence, just like linguistic competence. I had the competence to speak, to learn any language whatsoever. Then if I study Chinese, at one point I will be able to speak Chinese, right, as well as I can. So that's my excellence. The excellence is relative to me, of course, to anyone. If I study and practice Spanish, then I will be able at one point to speak Spanish, and so on and so forth, right? The competence is there. Then what's really important is the training and the activation process. Okay, I think it makes a lot of sense, right? So then you read the other also highlighted sections. This is very interesting, but toward the end of this first page, right, in book 2, he says that's highlighted for you also, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, right? We learn by doing them. For example, right, e.g., people become builders. How? By building. I mean, it's not that it is in their genetic code, in their blood, and so on and so forth, right? And they become lyre players, right? The lyre, a musical instrument, by playing the lyre, right? So too, then he goes very often. He does this, he starts from extra moral examples, and then he gets into the examples of ethics and morality. He says, so too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts. Okay, so it's not that I am brave or not brave from the beginning, since birth. I become brave. I become the opposite, right? One of the opposites, cowardly or rash, by doing, the corresponding activity, right? By doing brave, courageous things, I become brave. Okay, so that's. I hope this is clear how the activation, right, happens, and so, and then he says this is also important, right? The virtue and vice are built, constructed the same way. Again, it is from the same causes and by the same means that every virtue, that's on the next page, is both produced and destroyed, and similarly every art. Okay? For it is from playing the lyre that both good and bad lyre players are produced, and so on and so forth. Okay, I hope this is clear. It is by uh, experiencing the same thing and the way in which one then reacts to the same. This is also important in relation to pleasure and pain. I had to maybe anticipate some ideas, but if I do something brave, if I face a situation of danger, anyone can face a situation of danger. The question is, how do I deal with it, right? What is the approach, the attitude I have? If I, if I act well, let's say, if I do the right thing, and then I draw pleasure from my, good, brave, action, and I do it again and again, then I will at one point become brave, as if it were almost a kind of second nature. If I do, actually, if I'm not able to, right, withstand the situation, and and I act cowardly, right? So the question then is, if I feel pain because I have acted cowardly in that situation, then I will try to correct that. Next time, maybe I will try to do something different, to be more, courageous and so on. Then, but if I don't feel pain, if I actually feel some kind of pleasure from the action, then I will do it again and again until I become cowardly. The same with being rash, being whatever, just, unjust, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it comes down ultimately to the question also of pleasure and pain. What gives me pleasure, then I am likely to repeat, right? And of course, it is important to also distinguish, if you will, the good and bad, pleasures and pain as well, right? And so, but this is really what's important. The measure, in a sense, of what I will, repeat as well, do repeatedly, is given precisely by the pleasure, the pain that I get from doing what I do. Okay, so you will find this later. Again, I had to anticipate some things because there is so much to say. Book 2 and then 3. So in any case, he says this precisely just like it happens with learning, a language, an instrument, a musical instrument, and so on. This then is the case with the virtues. Also, by doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. The situation is the same, the transaction is the same, right? It's the how that changes then everything. And by doing the acts that I continue reading, we do in the presence of a danger, or being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly, right? It's the same situation that produces whatever trait of then character we end up having, right? Whatever character we end up having, it is the same situation that produces that, right? And it is the question of the activation, I repeat, process that is very important. So in any case, this is it was chapter 1 from book 2. Then he goes into the nature of actions. We can't again read everything together, but it is then here that in the second page from chapter 2, right, from book 2, that he introduces the question of the mean, right? Where he says in the second paragraph, the second half of the page. First, then, let's consider this, because he's speaking about the nature of the action. That it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defects and excess. Okay, so these are the two extremes that I have spoken about, that I spoke about last time as well, right? Defect, too little of something, excess, too much of something. These two extremes that are, keep this in mind, these are the vices, right? Virtue is in the middle between these two extremes, two vices, one over excess, one over deficiency or a defect. So as we see, and again, this is a wonderful page, wonderful, again, illustration, the extra moral examples, illustrations he gives to then get into the moral ones, okay, and he says precisely as we see in the case of strength and of health, right? And then there is a parenthesis, then he says both, and everybody would agree with this, right? On this, both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. Okay? So everybody agrees, eating too much is not good, eating too little is not good, exercising too much is not good, exercising too little is not good. So the question is, there is the right proportionate way, amount, the middle. Although this we will see, but keep this in mind, this is very important, this mean, the intermediate point, the right amount, the right measure is relative to us. Okay, people are different, even in terms of eating and exercising, you have to factor in many things such as, I don't know, health conditions, right? I mean, or age, or in terms of eating, a very active person will have to eat more probably than one who doesn't do anything all day in terms of physical activities and so on. All these things, again, it's not that there is one amount of one portion of food which is the same for all, one way, one measure for exercising and so on. It depends on many factors as well. Okay, so then he says, so too, just like in this extra moral, right, example, so too is it then in the case of temperance, which is another important virtue, right, and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies, I read because this is wonderful, so you can go back here and write something in relation to the mean, right, and the construction of character. The man who flies, the person, right, who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash or reckless, right? Both being rash and being cowardly, they're both opposites, different extremes, right? Opposites of being brave, being courageous. Okay, so to be brave is in the middle, the mean, the medium point, the intermediate point between too much, being rash, and too little, being cowardly. And this usually is the case. You will find at one point Aristotle says, there are activities or even feelings and so on that are always bad. You don't have the mean of killing, right? For example, that's the example he gives, right? I mean, it's always bad. Or, or envy. Same idea. It's not that you can find the mean, the intermediate point, right? No, some things are always bad, but by and large, the virtues and many other activities, situations do have, the mean, the balance. Okay, so and similarly, I read again, it's so wonderful. The man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none, right, become self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, right, then becomes insensible. Again, even in terms of pleasure, and pain, one has to find the right measure. Okay, so temperance and courage then are destroyed, I'm reading, by excess and defects or deficiency, and they are preserved by, and you find the word here, the mean. The mean, which is, I said already, I repeat over and over again, the intermediate point between too much and too little. Then read also, right, chapter 3 is also very important, speaking about the virtues and so on and so forth. Um, Pleasure and pain, like I said, you find this in the middle of the first page of chapter 3, highlighted after a semicolon. You read, but it is by reason of pleasures and pains that man become bad, by pursuing and avoiding this, either the pleasures and pains they ought not, or when they ought not, or as they ought not, or by going wrong in one of the other similar ways. Okay, so in any case, what I said before, the idea that again we cannot avoid, right, that dimension, pleasure and pain are fundamental, but the question is what we, let's put it this way, the lesson that we draw from what we do. Okay, so because in any case virtues and vices are concerned, he says at the end, at the bottom of this page, with the same things, right? So, like we saw, it is the same situation that will then bring about a situation of virtue, like good trait of character, or vice, bad trait of character, and so on. Okay, so read again all these, right? I mean, again, this week is books 2 and 3, especially the highlighted sections, but right, but we can't touch on all the points. There are many important points, but then he considers what virtue is on chapter 5, and um, he speaks about what we saw last time already, that it is a state, virtue is a state, just like vice is. Okay, so chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6 says, we must, however, not only describe virtue as a state of a character, but also say what sort of a state it is. I hope that this is clear. State, what does that mean? It means that, we get to a situation, a condition, a state where we can be said to be whatever, courageous, cowardly, good, bad, and so on, just like we can be said to be, speakers of Chinese, Spanish, and so on and so forth. That's a state where we get by a process of activation of a capacity, right? We begin from an initial state. Think about this. In our life, we a state, a situation, we are always in a situation, right, here and now. We begin from a state in which, right, so many things are open. Let's say to us, we have different capacities that we can activate. Then we activate one, and we get to the end of it, and we get to another state. We go from the initial state A to state B, right? At the initial state A, when, for example, where I had the capacity to, the ability to learn Chinese. I don't know Chinese yet, right? But I had that capacity. Then I repeat the action of studying Chinese over and over again. I activate that capacity until I get, right, to from state A, the initial state, to state B, where then when I am now a speaker of Chinese, and so on and so forth. The same with the moral things, right? I had the capacity to do just, brave, courageous actions. I had that capacity. Then the feeling also is important, and so on. Then I activate it by doing it over and over again. If I make a mistake, that's not going to change much. We can make mistakes and so on. The important thing is the aiming and the intention, right? But if I always try to do just or courageous things, right, then at one point I go from state A, the initial state where I had this capacity, to state B, where I am, then I have become courageous or cowardly, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I hope that this is clear, but that's the way in which it works, right? Of course, this construction of one's character doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are things that are not up to us, circumstances, but the question of ethics is to deal with the type of agency that we have, what is in our power. That what we will see. That's what we will see in book 3, and then next time with Epictetus as well. Okay, so then because again I have anticipated some of the themes, problems, concepts, but toward the end of this page you see also what I said before, that the intermediate point, right, the mean, is not in the object, right, like in eating, exercising, but it is relative to us, okay, like I said already, okay, and then there are so many other important things that we can't touch on because I want to move also to book 3 soon. But again, the question of the mean comes back, in particular in this chapter. Okay, so read it. It's very important. Then chapter 7 is also important. He speaks about feeling as well here, and then in chapter 8, he goes into the question of the difference and the relation between vices and virtue, which is the mean. Remember, these vices are precisely the two opposites, right? The two extremes. That's what he says at the beginning of chapter 8. Read that, pay attention to that as well. And he goes into the same question in a sense of he says chapter 9 begins with that moral virtue is a mean, then and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate, right? The middle point in passions and in actions. This has been sufficiently stated. Very often he sums up, the idea. But then, I don't want to again read. There are so many other things, important things that I will simply touch on. For example, the idea of the mean doesn't mean that one has to do always the same in a boring way. It is difficult to hit the mean, right? I mean, to keep the balance like on a tightrope, right? So he says this is very important, and that's at the end really of book 2 before moving to book 3, that at times in order to keep the mean, to keep the balance, we had to be able to lean toward right one extreme or the other, toward excess or deficiency, right? And so we are then able to keep the balance precisely. And also he says that look, I mean, at times, doing something which is that seems to be excessive, for example, is not missing completely the mean. It is still part of the logic of the mean. For example, being angry all the time. There are maybe people who are always angry. That's not good. In one's character, for one's own, happiness and the happiness of those around them, right? So, but Aristotle says to get angry for the right reason, with the right person, at the right time, and so on and so forth, that is also important. That is also part of keeping the mean. Not being able to, for example, get angry when one should, then that is another, if you will, problem, another vice, right? So again, it is really something which is relative to us and to the situation that we are going through, okay? So then, in any case, I want to move to book 3, but what I told you just now is really at the end, of book 2. Let me read that from the end, the last page on book 2. Just these few lines, just what I said. The man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed. And then at the very end, he says, but that we must incline, like I said, sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency. For so shall we most easily hit the mean, which is difficult to hit, right? And what is right. Okay? So, briefly and quickly, in a sense, book 3, which is very important. But look, I mean, book 3 begins with the distinction, very nice, also the way it's really fascinating, between voluntary, involuntary actions, and then he goes into decision, right? Deliberation and decision. And so he says precisely, since virtue is concerned, that's the outset of book 3, with passions and actions, and on voluntary passions and actions, praise and blame are granted, bestowed. On those that are involuntary, maybe even pardon, sometimes pity, and so on and so forth. Then we have to distinguish between the voluntary and the involuntary. Okay, so and what is involuntary is really in a strict sense not much, right? I mean, the examples he gives, right? I mean, if a tyrant were to order one to do something bad, something base, having one's parents and children in his power, and if one did the action, they were to be saved, but otherwise they would be put to death, then maybe I do what they force me to do, what they ask me to do. But that doesn't mean that there is really a voluntary action in the full sense of the word, that it is the ethical action that I would have done. However, at the same time, this is not completely involuntary, right? Because when I do something that I am forced even to do, I could still not do it. And they say, do whatever you want, with me, and so on and so on. I'm not going to do it. If I do it, so there is a degree of something which is voluntary, right? I do it myself, I use my whatever, um, hands to, like in the case of Socrates dying, drinking the poison in prison, he drank it, right? Of course, that wasn't his decision. That's where we get into this. And principle of action. The principle of action is outside. They are forcing me to do something. It may be understandable that I do it, right? I mean, people can forgive me, pardon me, even pity me, but what can I do? This is not completely involuntary. There is this category, very interesting. You will see that Aristotle says it is a mixed action. It is mixed between the voluntary and the involuntary, but it is more like the voluntary than the involuntary. Again, we can't go into all this, but the involuntary action as such is only when, for example, if someone is pushed away by the wind, right? If someone falls off the cliff because of the wind or whatever, if someone is kidnapped, then and moves, that is completely involuntary. In this case, Aristotle says one is no longer an agent but a victim, he says. Okay, so in any case, just because of the time that we don't have much, right? Again, he speaks about the question of ignorance, for example, right? He says everything that is done, by reason of ignorance is not voluntary, so that's important. If I make a mistake, because I am ignorant of some particulars, I don't know, right? I give someone something to drink, thinking someone who's sick, for example, thinking that this thing, drug, whatever, may help them, but I am ignorant of some kind of, particular, like that this person has some type of allergy or whatever, intolerance, and I do the opposite of helping. I harm. Involuntary, that's because I didn't know something, maybe I should have known it, but in any case, that doesn't make me, a bad, let's say, person. Insofar, however, pay attention to this, as if I do something by mistake or by ignorance, then I had to feel pain and regret. And this is something that no one is going to judge me. It's not even evident from the outside. This is something that I can see, that I know, right? Whether I feel pain and regret because I did something that I didn't mean to do, meaning to do something. The intention, which is so important in Aristotle, as we saw already, right? So he speaks about the question of compulsion and so on and so forth. We can't go into that because it's already kind of late, but it is in book 2 that you see that he deals with decision, and then the next book, deliberation, although Aristotle himself says in life, right, deliberation, thinking about what to do, the pros and cons, should I do this, should I do that, and so on and so forth. Deliberation comes before decision, but he chooses to speak about decision first, decision or a choice. You have the word choice here, but it is decision, same idea, which preference as well, but decision is interesting because, I can't go into that now, but it gives this sense of cutting oneself away from a situation. When I make a choice, then I cannot go back, because if the decision is a real decision, right? Because before decision comes deliberation, I think, and I can think at times in some situations, maybe for a long period of time, right? And then when I decide, if the decision is real, then that's the threshold of action, right? Right. If I decide to leave tomorrow and go whatever, right, on a journey and so on, if the decision is real, right? Because if I change my mind, then that means that it wasn't really ultimately a decision. I was still, in the at the level of deliberation. I changed my mind. Okay, but if I don't, right, then the decision is the threshold of action. Then when I act, I cannot take back, right, what the action was. As he says in another point that we are not reading, but a wonderful example, after I throw a stone, I cannot take it back. I mean, what is done, as everybody knows, cannot be undone. That's the point, okay? So that's why deliberation is very important decision to can we deliberate again. I am anticipating things that you will find very important things in the next book. Sorry, chapter 3. I read that first, okay? Chapter 3, the top. Do we deliberate about everything, and is everything a possible subject of deliberation, or is deliberation impossible about some things? Of course, think about that. But the answer is right there. Yes, we cannot deliberate, right, about everything, and this will come back with Epictetus next time, because precisely some things are up to us and some aren't, right? We can deliberate about the things that are up to us. We can't deliberate, it would be a waste of time even, but we can't about something past, right? Deliberation is only about something future, something that we can do. We can't deliberate about the exact sciences, mathematics, and so on and so forth, the weather, and so on and so forth, right? So there are things that are not open to deliberation. We had to know what is open to deliberation, and that is, what is it? What is up to us, right? Which comes back in Epictetus, the beginning of the book that we see next time, okay? So we deliberate about what is up to us, and then accordingly we decide. We choose, right? We had a preference, we choose, and sorry, I'm going back to chapter 2, but that's where he says at the beginning, choice, decision, then seems to be voluntary, but not the same thing as the voluntary. This is interesting, kind of difficult. I leave that to you to think about what this might be. kind of your thinking exercise for this week. What does that mean? And then he gets into the question of how children and lower so-called animals share involuntary actions but not in choice. I'm not sure about that as well, but the idea is that at times I may do something that is voluntary but that lacks decision, so it lacks the principle of action, right? I mean, if I, overreact to something, right? In a heated argument, I say something, I do something that then I immediately regret, and I say I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that, but I did say, I did do whatever, right? So I cannot say, oh, I did it involuntarily. No, it was voluntary, although maybe I didn't have enough time to deliberate, think about what I was doing or saying, and then also deciding, yeah, I'll do this, or no, I won't do this, and so on. I just did what I did on the spur of the moment, as Aristotle says, but it is still voluntary, okay? But it is different from the ethical. Basically, that's what you have to keep in mind, that the ethical action is the action, and then the action that. Ethical action here doesn't mean necessarily good action, right? The action that belongs in the on the plane of ethics, right? Which can be the virtuous action, the vicious action, and so on and so forth. Um, this is the action which has precisely decision inside. The action that comes because of deliberation, after deliberation, that there is decision, the action for which I am the agent, I have agency, I have the principle of action within, or as Aristotle himself says, wonderful, I am the principle of action, meaning no one is forcing me to do things, something externally. There is no internal compulsion, whatever type, right? I mean, we can go into that. There is something very interesting in that sense too. I just do it. Because the ethical action is not that I just do it. I do it because because that's exactly what I want to do, so to speak, right? What I have thought about, what I am aiming. I am aiming at something, and in aiming there must be this clear awareness, and I am precisely not simply do I act, right? It's not simply the fact that I do something, that I am the doer, the actor, so to speak, right? The agent, but I also am the principle of that very action, okay? So I hope this is clear. Again, contact me if you have questions and so on. Next time we will read, right? So this is the class actually this week is right from starts uh, Thursday, May 14th, right? And then ends Tuesday, May 19th. Okay, this is the week in which we are doing Aristotle. Write your entry, and then we will soon also, will also soon schedule a Zoom meeting, community kind of meeting, so that we again can touch base. Okay, thank you. See you next time.